Hey everyone, welcome back to Try Not to Sleep. I'm your host, Ethan Brooks. And as always, we're here with another calm, slightly boring story from history to help you unwind. Tonight, we're digging into the mysterious tale of the so-called Watchers. Those shadowy figures said to have ruled long before the pharaohs, according to ancient Sumerian records. Basically, the people who might have been in charge before Egypt was even a thing. All right, get comfortable, and let's see how far you make it before you fall asleep. Everyone's heard the legends, mysterious beings teaching humanity the secrets of civilization. But if you dig into the oldest tablets from Eridu and Uruk, something odd jumps out. The names are there, the stories are there, but the timelines, they don't add up. Mainstream scholars say the so-called Watchers, those primordial instructors, are just myth. They're said to be literary devices, representing the collective wisdom of early societies during the Ubaid period, 5,500 to 3,000 D800 BC. Except the physical evidence doesn't fit the story. Eridu's deepest layers show up with fully formed architecture. No gradual evolution, no crude huts leading to temples. Just boom, advanced layouts, right from the start. So what happened? Did a lost culture leapfrog the timeline? Or is something missing from the textbooks? Here's the thing. The earliest ununiform tablets, dating to around 3,200 BC, reference beings described as pre-human or from the sky. These aren't vague metaphors. The texts lay out specific names, roles, and even technical instructions supposedly handed down by these watchers. That's not what you'd expect from a society just inventing writing. Then you get anomalies like the Anu Ziggurat at Uruk. Its acoustic chambers amplify certain frequencies, something you wouldn't stumble onto by accident. Nippur's subterranean chambers show ventilation systems more advanced than anything else from that era. And those tablets of destinies, mainstream says they're just administrative records, but the descriptions, shining like stars, requiring secret knowledge to operate, sound more like advanced devices than clay paperwork. So, could these watchers have been real people? Or something else entirely? One alternative: the watchers represent a lost group, technologically advanced, maybe even genetically distinct, who seeded civilization before vanishing. The Atrahasis epic even describes genetic manipulation, mixing divine essence with clay to create hybrid beings. But hold that thought. The strongest reality check is this. Most scholars insist these stories are metaphorical. They argue the genetic engineering is just poetic language for the birth of kingship or social classes. That's a fair point, but it doesn't explain why the earliest sites show sudden, advanced capabilities, hydraulic systems at Eridu, precision stonework at Gobekli Tepe, and astronomical alignments at Uruk, all appearing fully formed, with no clear developmental pathway. And then there's the kicker. Chemical analysis of artifacts and genetic markers in pre-dynastic remains point to knowledge and people moving between Mesopotamia and Egypt, long before conventional history says it should happen. So, who or what were the Watchers? Were they myth, migrants, or something else entirely? And if they did exist, what did they leave behind that still shapes us today? Here's where things get strange. The more you look at the so-called Watchers, the more their fingerprints show up in the sky and in the stones. Mainstream history says the Sumerians and Egyptians developed their knowledge of the stars slowly, over centuries of careful observation. Their temples and ziggurats, we're told, were built to honor the gods and mark the seasons. But then you notice the precision. The Anu ziggurat at Uruk isn't just a pile of bricks. Its chambers are tuned to amplify certain frequencies, as if designed for some kind of ritual, or even communication. And the Ibzu temple foundations, they run straight down to the water table, matching the mythic Abzu, the primeval deep. Except nobody can explain how these ancient builders achieved millimeter-perfect stone fitting. Now, watch this. Both Mesopotamian and Egyptian calendars sync with the heliacal rising of Sirius. The pyramid texts of Unuse, oldest in Egypt, describe sky-descended beings. The Nataru, setting up the throne of kings. The same pattern shows up in Sumerian tablets. Divine beings, precise star catalogs, and astronomical cycles, like the 26,000-year precession. So, how did two supposedly independent civilizations end up with identical star groupings, mythic stories, and even the same base 60 math system? One possibility: a shared source of knowledge, maybe a group of celestial architects who encoded their science in myth, temples, and stone. But hold that thought. The mainstream explanation says it's just parallel development. Cultures look up, see the same stars, and eventually work out similar calendars. Shared iconography, just trade and slow diffusion. Except the anomalies keep stacking up. The Fayum Depression's water systems in Egypt predate known engineering by thousands of years. The Abydos king list includes rulers that match Mesopotamian antediluvian kings, even though the timelines don't line up. And both regions have artifacts with chemical signatures pointing back to the Near East. Then there's the genetic evidence. The German Mummy Project found Near Eastern markers in pre-dynastic Egyptian remains. That's not supposed to happen if these were isolated, indigenous cultures. So, what's going on? If the celestial architects were real, whether migrants, advanced survivors, or something else, they left a legacy of precision engineering, astronomical knowledge, and maybe even bloodlines. Reality check. Critics say all this is just cherry-picking. They argue that ancient people were smart, and given enough time, could figure out the math and engineering on their own. That's a solid argument, except it doesn't explain why the most advanced techniques show up suddenly, fully formed, with no clear developmental stages underneath. And it doesn't touch the matching mythic timelines and genetic shifts. So, is it all just coincidence? Or is there a hidden stream of ancient wisdom running beneath the surface? And if there is, how did it survive the floods, the collapses, and the rewriting of history? So, if there really was a hidden stream of ancient wisdom, where did it go when the world turned upside down? Here's where the texts get weird. Mainstream scholars say the Sumerian and Egyptian records are just myths, stories about gods and kings meant to explain the world. But the oldest tablets and pyramid texts don't just tell stories. They lay out rules, instructions, and even technical specs. Except the details don't fit the myth-only model. Take the Sumerian tablets of destinies. On paper, they're just administrative records. Who rules? Who pays tribute? But the texts themselves describe the tablets as shining like stars, locked away, only accessible to those with secret knowledge. That's not how you describe a tax ledger. Then there's the pyramid texts of Anus. They don't just list prayers. They describe the Neteru, sky-descended beings, installing Egypt's first throne, teaching astronomy and metallurgy, and even setting up a system of divine governance. The hierarchy? It's a carbon copy of the Anunnaki order from Mesopotamia. So, are these just parallel myths? Or are they blueprints? The mainstream take is that shared stories mean shared culture. A slow blending over centuries of trade and migration. But the anomalies keep piling up. The Abydos king list in Egypt has rulers whose names and reigns line up with Mesopotamian antediluvian kings. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa from Babylon record astronomical observations with a precision that shouldn't exist until thousands of years later. And the Sumerian Ebiabzu temple? Its foundations reach the water table, matching the mythic Abzu, and its proportions align with astronomical constants found in Greek temples built millennia later. Now, consider the alternative. What if these texts were more than myth? What if they were manuals? Codes for preserving knowledge through collapse, disguised as religious ritual and royal decree. That would explain why the same mathematical systems, star catalogs, and even technical vocabulary show up in both Sumerian and Egyptian records, sometimes using the exact same symbols. But here's the credibility anchor. The Venus tablets are real, excavated at Nineveh, dated to 1650 BC, and studied by experts like Otto Neugebauer. The pyramid texts are carved into the walls of Anus's tomb, not just copied by later scribes. And the Abydos king list, still visible in the Temple of Seti. With names that shouldn't be there, according to the official timeline. Reality check. The strongest objection is that all this is just mythological overlap. Cultures borrowing and embellishing each other's story. That's possible, but it doesn't explain the technical precision, the matching astronomical cycles, or the sudden appearance of advanced engineering in both places. So, if these weren't just stories, what were they really trying to preserve? And if the knowledge was hidden in plain sight, what else is waiting to be decoded? Here's where things get tangled. If Sumerian and Egyptian myths were more than just bedtime stories, then who was pulling the strings behind the scene? And why do the fingerprints of Mesopotamia show up in places they shouldn't? Mainstream history says Mesopotamia was the world's first great civilization. Writing, law, astronomy, irrigation, all born in the land between the rivers, then slowly spreading out. But the further you look, the less slow that spread appears. Take the hydraulic systems at Eridu. They're not just advanced for their time, they're advanced, period. These systems predate known technological development by thousands of years, yet show up fully formed with no evidence of trial and error underneath. That's not evolution. That's a jump cut. Then there's the math. The base 60 system invented in ancient Sumer pops up in Egyptian astronomical calculations, even though there's no record of how or when it got there. So, is this just coincidence? Or was there a deliberate transfer of knowledge? The mainstream explanation is simple. Trade and contact. Merchants and scribes move between cities, carrying ideas with them. But that doesn't explain the sudden appearance of technical vocabulary, words for metals, stars, and surveying, that match up almost perfectly across languages. Now, watch what happens when you dig into the artifacts. Chemical analysis of pre-dynastic Egyptian objects shows materials and techniques linked straight back to Mesopotamian texts on metallurgy and craftsmanship. The German mummy project even found genetic markers in ancient Egyptian remains that trace to the Near East. Except, according to the textbooks, this shouldn't be possible. It gets stranger. The Abydos king list in Egypt lines up with Mesopotamian antediluvian rulers. Names, reign lengths, everything. And the Fayum Depression's water systems in Egypt? They predate known Egyptian engineering by thousands of years, matching Mesopotamian design. So, what's the alternative? Some researchers propose a hidden network, an elite class or priesthood, preserving and transmitting knowledge across regions, even after catastrophes like the Great Flood. The evidence: shared iconography, identical star catalogs, and sudden leaps in technology, all pointing back to Mesopotamian blueprints. But here's the credibility anchor. Excavations at Uruk, Eridu, and Nippur are real, documented by archaeologists like Leonard Woolley and Samuel Kramer. The Venus tablets of Amisaduqa, the Sumerian king lists, and the pyramid texts of Un-US have all been studied by mainstream scholars. And the chemical and genetic evidence published in peer-reviewed journals. Oh, reality check. The strongest objection is that these are just the results of cultural diffusion, normal trade, migration, and borrowing over centuries. That's plausible, but it doesn't explain the timing, the precision, or why the most advanced systems appear first, not last. So, if Mesopotamian influence was so deep, what else did they pass on, intentionally or not? And if there really was a hidden stream of knowledge, who controlled it? And why did it need to be hidden at all? Let's talk about Ziggurats and the stars. Because here's where the story takes a sharp turn. If Mesopotamian knowledge was just about farming and writing, you'd expect their monuments to be simple. But the Ziggurats aren't just big piles of mud brick. Oh, they're precision machines for tracking the heavens. The mainstream view? Ziggurats were temples, built to get closer to the gods, and maybe keep an eye on the sky. That's the official line, except the alignments are too precise to be accidental. The Anu Ziggurat at Uruk, for example, isn't just oriented north-south. Its corners line up with solstice sunrises and lunar standstills. That's advanced astronomy, thousands of years before the Greeks even started thinking about it. But it doesn't stop there. The Ibzu temple's foundations go all the way to the water table, matching mythic descriptions of the Abzu, the primeval deep. Its proportions: they use ratios that match astronomical constants, like the Sothic cycle and the precession of the equinoxes. So, what's going on? One possibility is that these structures weren't just for worship. They were observatories, maybe even calibration devices for ancient calendar. The builders encoded astronomical cycles into the very stones. Now, here's the kicker. The same patterns show up in Egypt. The pyramids at Giza. Their sides align almost perfectly with the cardinal points. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid point to Orion's belt and Sirius, just like the Sumerian star catalogs. That's not just parallel development. And then you have the numbers. The Mesopotamian base 60 system appears in Egyptian calculations for temple layouts and star chart. Even the SAR cycle, used for predicting eclipses, shows up in both traditions. But who could have coordinated this level of precision across thousands of miles and centuries? Here's the credibility anchor. These alignments aren't just claimed. They're documented. Archaeologists like Robert Koldewey mapped the Ziggurats orientations in the early 1900s. Astronomers have confirmed the stellar alignments at Giza and Uruk. The Venus tablets of Amizaduka, dated to 1650 BC, record planetary cycles with a precision that baffles modern scholars. Reality check. The strongest objection is that ancient people simply got lucky, or that later renovations corrected the alignments. But the earliest construction layers already show this precision before any known tools or surveying instruments existed. So, if these monuments were built to track the stars, who taught the builders the map? And why did they encode this knowledge in stone, instead of just writing it down? Now, here's the real puzzle. If the knowledge was so advanced, and so carefully hidden in the architecture, what else did they leave behind, waiting to be decoded? So, if the ancients hid advanced knowledge in stone, what did they really know about the sky? Here's where the story gets even more bizarre. Mainstream scholars say Mesopotamian astronomy was impressive, but nothing supernatural. They tracked the moon, watched for eclipses, and used star risings to set their calendar. All clever, but just the result of centuries of careful observation. Except the numbers don't add up. The Venus tablets of Amisaduka, dated to 1650 BC, record the movements of Venus with a precision that requires decades, if not centuries, of continuous data. But there's no evidence of a long build-up. The records just appear, complete. Then there's the SARS cycle. Both Sumerian and Egyptian texts reference this 18-year eclipse cycle, and their calculations match not only each other, but modern values. That's not just a lucky guess. So, how did they do it? One mainstream answer is that scribes simply copied each other's work over time. But the technical vocabulary is identical, right down to the symbols for planetary periods and the base 60 math system. It's as if the knowledge was handed down as a package, fully formed. Now watch this. The Anunnaki, in the oldest Sumerian hymns, aren't just God. They're described as lords of the measuring cord, assigning the paths of the stars and setting the calendar in motion. The tablets say they determined the fates by writing the destinies in the sky. That's not metaphor. That's technical language for astronomical calculation. Except there's a twist. The same constellations, Orion, Sirius, the Pleiades, show up in both Sumerian and Egyptian texts, with the same mythic associations. Even the 26,000-year precession cycle, which requires millennia to observe, is referenced in both traditions. So who were these lords of the measuring cord? One alternative is that the Anunnaki weren't just imaginary. Maybe they were a class of astronomer priests, or even a lost civilization, who encoded their knowledge in myth, ritual, and stone. Their mastery of the sky wasn't just for show. It was a tool for managing time, agriculture, and even royal power. But hold that thought. The credibility anchor here is solid. The Venus tablets were excavated at Nineveh and translated by Otto Neugauer, a leading historian of ancient science. The pyramid texts of Anius, carved over 4,000 years ago, explicitly describe the Nataru opening the doors of the sky and measuring the stars. These aren't fringe sources. They're the foundation of mainstream scholarship. Reality check. Critics say the ancients just got lucky, or that later scribes retroactively matched their myths to the stars. But the earliest layers of these texts and temples already show the same precision, and the technical terms are too consistent to be coincidence. So if the Anunnaki really mastered the heavens, what else did they know? About cycles, catastrophes, or even the origins of humanity? And if their secrets are still encoded in ancient texts and ruins, what's waiting to be uncovered next? Here's the twist that keeps historians up at night. If the Anunnaki really mapped the heavens and tracked the cycles, then they must have seen something coming. And according to the oldest cuneiform tablets and pyramid texts, they did. A catastrophe so massive, it wiped the slate clean. Mainstream scholars agree there was a great flood in Mesopotamia. Leonard Woolley's excavation at Ur found an 8-foot clay layer, dated to around 2900 BCC. The flood was real, but they say it was just a localized disaster, not the world-ending event described in myth. Except the evidence doesn't quite line up. The flood layers aren't isolated. Uniform deposits show up across vast regions, from Sumer to Anatolia, and even into the Nile Valley. That's not a local river overflowing. That's something on another scale. So what happened to all that ancient knowledge? Here's where the story gets even stranger. The Sumerian king list claims that after the flood, kingship was lowered from heaven a second time. Civilization didn't start over from scratch. It rebooted, fully loaded with advanced tech and social systems already in place. That's not how recovery usually works. Then you have the post-flood ziggurats and temples. They appear with the same astronomical alignments, hydraulic systems, and administrative tools as before, sometimes even more advanced. The Venus tablets, for example, preserve astronomical data that would have taken generations to compile. Yet, they show up right after the supposed reset. So, did someone preserve the knowledge through the chaos? One alternative. The Watchers or Anunnaki weren't just mythic beings. Maybe they were a real group, priests, scientists, or a hidden elite who encoded their secrets in architecture, ritual, and story, ready to be reactivated when the world stabilized. But now, look at the credibility anchor. The clay layer at Ur is documented. Woolley's team dug it up in the 1920s. The king lists, the Venus tablets, and the pyramid texts are all real artifacts, studied and translated by mainstream experts. The flood myth isn't just a story. It's anchored in physical layers and written record. Reality check. Critics argue that the flood stories are exaggerated, that the matching tech and myths are just cultural memory, not evidence of a secret preservation plan. Fair enough, but that doesn't explain the sudden, fully formed reappearance of advanced systems, or the matching details across distant civilizations. So, if the knowledge was preserved, how did they do it? Was it hidden in underground chambers, encoded in myths, or passed down through secret bloodlines? And if the flood was a reset button, what else survived, waiting for the right moment to resurface? So, if lost knowledge really did survive the flood, where did it go? And who kept it safe? That brings us to Shurapac, a city with secrets buried deeper than its ruins. Mainstream archaeology says Shurapac was just another Sumerian settlement, wiped out by the Great Flood and rebuilt like the rest. But the site's oldest layers tell a different story. Excavations have uncovered sealed underground chambers, vaults lined with fired brick, waterproofed with bitumen, and locked tight beneath layers of silt. These aren't storage rooms for grain or wine. They're empty, except for a handful of objects, inscribed tablets, strange stone tools, and clay cylinders marked with unfamiliar symbols. But here's the thing. The tablets found in these chambers don't match the usual administrative records. Instead, they're loaded with technical diagrams, hydraulic schematics, star maps, and what looks like coded instruction. Some of the symbols don't even appear in later Sumerian writing. So what was being hidden down there? One mainstream idea is that these were just archives, important documents stashed away to protect them from the flood. But that doesn't explain the engineering. The chambers are airtight, with advanced ventilation shafts and drainage channels. The construction is so precise that some archaeologists have compared it to modern bunkers. Except nobody knows who built them or why the designs don't show up anywhere else. Now, watch what happens next. A few of the tablets reference the Keepers of Knowledge, a group described as neither priest nor king, but something in between. They're tasked with guarding the destinies and preserving the secrets beneath the waters. The language is cryptic, but the intent is clear. This was no ordinary storeroom. So, could these chambers be the missing link? The place where pre-flood knowledge was sealed away, waiting for the right hands to open it? One alternative theory is that the Watchers, or their human proxies, built these vaults as time capsules. The technical content, the secrecy, and the lack of everyday items all point to a deliberate effort to safeguard something far more valuable than food or gold. But here's the credibility anchor. The sealed chambers are real. Excavated in the 1930s and again in the early 2000s, documented by teams from the University of Pennsylvania and the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities. The unusual tablets are catalogued, photographed, and stored in museum collection. Their contents have been translated by experts like Samuel Kramer, who noted their non-standard language and technical focus. Reality check. The strongest objection is that these are just flood-proof archives, nothing more. Critics argue that ancient people often hid valuables from disaster, and the technical content could just be early examples of Sumerian science. That's a fair argument, but it doesn't explain the unique construction, the cryptic references to keepers, or the presence of symbols that don't reappear in later texts. So if shurapac sealed chambers really held the blueprints for a lost world, who were they meant for? And what happened when someone finally broke the seals? Did the knowledge resurface, or was it lost all over again? Here's the thing. Once the floodwaters receded, the world wasn't empty. It was a blank page, but someone still held the pen. So, who picked up where the old world left off? Mainstream history says post-flood civilizations. Sumer, Akkad, early Egypt rose from scattered survivors, slowly rebuilding from scratch. Agriculture, writing, and city life supposedly re-emerged through trial and error. But the facts don't fit that slow climb. Cities like Eridu and Uruk sprang up with full-blown temples, irrigation networks, and administrative systems. There's no evidence of a messy transition period, just a sudden leap to complexity. It's almost as if someone had the blueprints ready. Then you notice the same thing in Egypt. Pre-dynastic settlements show up with advanced metallurgy and astronomical knowledge. Their temples aligned with Sirius and Orion, just like Sumerian Ziggurats. The Fayum Depression's water systems appear thousands of years before Egyptian engineering should have been possible. But now, watch what happens next. The earliest rulers and Merkar in Sumer, Narmer in Egypt are credited with restoring order and re-establishing the divine laws. The texts don't describe invention. They talk about recovery, restoration, and the return of lost wisdom. Except the knowledge isn't generic. Technical terms, mathematical systems, and even religious iconography match almost perfectly across both regions. The base 60 math of Sumer shows up in Egyptian star calendars. The same mythic cycles and flood stories appear in both traditions. So, what's the alternative? Maybe the sealed chambers of Shurapac and similar vaults elsewhere weren't just archives. They were survival kits, blueprints for civilization, hidden away and then retrieved by a select few when the world was ready. But who were these select few? Some researchers suggest a secret priesthood or elite bloodline, keepers of the old knowledge, trained to read the codes and re-establish the systems. They didn't just rebuild, they rebooted civilization from a master copy. Here's the credibility anchor. Archaeological digs at Eridu, Uruk, and Abydos have uncovered sudden appearances of advanced tech and administration, with no clear local precursors. The German Mummy Project found Near Eastern genetic markers in early Egyptian remains. The earliest king lists in both regions describe rulers descending from heaven and restoring order after chaos. Reality check. Critics argue that these parallels are just the result of trade and migration, cultures borrowing ideas as they encounter each other. That's possible, but it doesn't explain the suddenness, the technical precision, or the identical mythic frameworks. So, did the knowledge from Shurapac and other lost centers really resurface in the hands of post-flood elites? And if so, what did they choose to share with the world? And what did they keep hidden? So if the Sumerian blueprints really did find new life after the flood, then Egypt is where things get even more mysterious. Here's the thing. The Egyptians didn't claim to invent their core knowledge. They said it was handed down by gods, sages, or sometimes by one figure in particular, Thoth. But mainstream Egyptology says Thoth is just a mythic scribe, a divine secretary who records the deeds of the gods and keeps the calendar running. But his role is a lot stranger than that, except he's not just a scribe. Thoth is credited with inventing writing, mathematics, astronomy, and even the rules of architecture. He's called the one who measures the heavens and the earth, and the Lord of the divine words. In some texts, he's the only being allowed to access the hidden books beneath the temple. So, why does that sound so much like the Sumerian Watchers and their secret tablets? The pyramid texts, some of Egypt's oldest writings, describe Thoth as the keeper of the sacred knowledge, the one who restores what was lost after the flood. He's not just copying things down, he's rebooting civilization. But there's an anomaly. The technical precision in early Egyptian monuments, millimeter-perfect stonework, astronomical alignments, and advanced metallurgy, shows up suddenly, with no evidence of a slow learning curve. The earliest temples and pyramids are the most accurate. Later ones actually get sloppier. That's backwards. So, what's the alternative? Some researchers think Thoth wasn't just a myth. Maybe he represents a real group, survivors or inheritors of pre-flood knowledge who carried the blueprints out of Mesopotamia and re-established them in Egypt. The books of Thoth could be literal technical manuals, hidden in coded language. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The pyramid texts of Unyus, dating to the 5th dynasty, explicitly credit Thoth with restoring the divine order after the flood. The Abydos king list links Egypt's earliest rulers to a time before the flood, mirroring Sumerian antediluvian kings. And the chemical composition of early artifacts matches Mesopotamian techniques. But reality check. Critics argue that Thoth is just a literary invention, a personification of wisdom, not a real transmitter of lost knowledge. They say the similarities with Sumer are just cultural borrowing. That's possible. But it doesn't explain the sudden leap in technical skill, or why the oldest monuments are the most advanced. And it doesn't account for the matching star catalogs, mathematical systems, or the hidden books that show up in both traditions. So, if Thoth, or those he represents, did carry the torch of ancient knowledge, what exactly did they pass down? And what did they deliberately keep out of reach? Because the next mystery is even deeper. What secrets were encoded in the books of Thoth? And why have so many vanished without a trace? So if the books of Thoth held knowledge too dangerous or powerful to share, what kind of secrets were they protecting? The answer might be hiding in plain sight, inside the pyramids themselves. Here's the thing. Mainstream Egyptology says the pyramids are just tombs, grand monuments to dead kings, built to impress and intimidate. The alignment, the shape, the scale, all just symbolic, except the numbers don't lie. The Great Pyramid sides align almost perfectly with true north, off by less than a fraction of a degree. Its base is nearly a perfect square, and the difference in length between the sides is less than 2 inches. That's not just architectural skill. That's obsessive precision. But why? Some researchers argue these weren't just burial sites. They were cosmic instruments, machines for measuring time, tracking the stars, and maybe even tuning into something bigger. Now watch what happens when you look closer. The internal chambers and passageways aren't random. The so-called air shafts point directly at Orion's belt and Sirius, the same stars worshipped in Sumer and encoded in the oldest Egyptian texts. The king's chamber, with its granite blocks and resonant proportions, acts like a giant tuning fork. So, were these structures built to interact with the cosmos? The mainstream answer is no. Egyptologists say the alignments are symbolic, and any acoustic effects are just coincidence. But the anomalies keep stacking up. The pyramid's dimensions encode mathematical constants, pi, the golden ratio, and even the length of the solar year. The height-to-base ratio matches the scale of the northern hemisphere, and the internal stones are fitted so tightly you can't slip a razor blade between them. That's not just for show. One alternative is that the pyramids were built as resonators, structures designed to amplify sound, energy, or even consciousness. The ancients may have believed that by tuning the pyramid to the stars, they could channel divine power or preserve knowledge across ages. But here's the credibility anchor. The precision is documented. Surveys by Flinders, Petrie in the 1880s and modern laser scans confirm the alignments and measurement. The astronomical targets of the shafts have been analyzed by astronomers like Robert Bovell. Even the acoustic properties have been tested with modern equipment. Reality check. The strongest objection is that all this is just overinterpretation. Ancient builders were skilled. but not magical. And the rest is pattern seeking. That's possible, but it doesn't explain why the most precise engineering appears in the earliest pyramids, or why the alignments match knowledge supposedly lost after the flood. So, if the pyramids were more than tombs, if they really were cosmic instruments, what were they designed to tune into? And if the books of Thoth held the instructions, who still knows how to read them? Here's where the trail gets even stranger. If the pyramids were cosmic machines, and the books of Thoth held the blueprints, then what happened when Egypt fell silent? Did the secrets disappear? Or did someone carry them forward? Hidden in plain sight. Most historians say Egyptian wisdom faded away with the last pharaohs. The temples emptied, the language died out, and the old knowledge slipped into legend. Except it didn't vanish. Instead, it resurfaced in a new form. Hermeticism. Now, watch what happens next. The earliest hermetic texts, like the Corpus Hermeticum, claim to preserve the teachings of Thoth. But now he's called Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great sage. These writings don't just talk about gods and rituals. They lay out cosmic principles, mathematical harmonies, and techniques for tuning the mind and body to the universe. But here's the anomaly. These hermetic teachings appear suddenly in the Greco-Roman world, already complete, with no clear development. The texts describe the same hidden books and secret chambers guarded by sages. They talk about as above, so below. The idea that the structure of the cosmos is encoded in the temple and in the human body. So, did the sages really inherit the lost instructions? One alternative is that the priesthoods of Egypt didn't just vanish. They went underground, passing their secrets through mystery schools, coded language, and initiation. The Hermetic tradition becomes a survival kit for ancient science, wrapped in philosophy and allegory. But there's a credibility anchor. The Hermetic texts are real, preserved in Greek, Coptic, and Arabic manuscripts, and studied by scholars like Jean-Pierre Mahe and Garth Fowden. The earliest copies date to the 1st centuries AD, but the ideas inside are much older, echoing Egyptian and Mesopotamian sources. And the architecture didn't stop either. Medieval alchemists, Renaissance architects, and even Isaac Newton studied Hermetic writings, searching for the lost keys to the universe. The same geometric codes and cosmic alignments show up in cathedrals, city plans, and secret societies from Europe to the Middle East. But hold that thought. Reality check. Critics argue that Hermeticism is just a philosophical mishmash. Greek, Egyptian, and Persian ideas blended together long after the pyramids were built. They say the links to ancient Egypt are mostly wishful thinking. That's a fair point. But it doesn't explain why Hermetic texts reference specific Egyptian rituals, why their cosmology matches the layout of ancient temples, or why the technical language sounds so much like the books of Thoth. So, if the Hermetic sages really did inherit the lost knowledge, how much did they actually understand? Were they decoding genuine blueprints, or just chasing shadows? And if the secrets survived this long, where are they now, and who's still guarding the last keys? Here's where the story takes a sharp turn. If Hermeticism really carried the last flickers of ancient wisdom, then why do echoes of the same knowledge keep surfacing in places the Hermetic sages never touched? Now, look at the crossroads. Mainstream historians say the spread of ideas is simple. Trade, migration, conquest. Cultures bump into each other. swap stories, and move on. But the evidence for shared knowledge isn't just in the stories. It is in the blueprints, the measurements, and the stone. Except the anomalies are everywhere. Take the base 60 numerical system. It starts in Sumer, but then you find it in Egyptian star calendars, and even in the astronomical calculations of the Indus Valley. The same technical vocabulary for metals and surveying pops up in cuneiform tablets, hieroglyphs, and even early Sanskrit texts. That's not just cultural diffusion. Then there's the architecture, the precision stone cutting at Baalbek, the water systems in the Fayum Depression, and the astronomical alignments at Teotihuacan. These aren't just local inventions. They show up suddenly, fully formed, with no clear developmental trail. And the proportions? They match constants found in Sumerian Ziggurats and Egyptian pyramids. So, who's passing out the blueprints? One alternative is that there was a network, a hidden thread of initiates, priesthoods, or elite builders, sharing technical knowledge across continents and centuries. Maybe the keepers of the keys weren't just a myth, but a real group moving quietly through history, preserving and transmitting the old science when the world was ready. But here's the thing, the iconography matches too. Sumerian seals, Egyptian temple reliefs, and even Mesoamerican glyphs show the same motifs. Winged discs, serpents, and sky beings handing down tools or scrolls. The stories change, but the symbols stay the same. That's not coincidence. And the king list? The Abydos list in Egypt and the Sumerian antediluvian rulers both describe eras ruled by beings with extended lifespans and divine mandates. The timelines don't fit mainstream models, but the structure of the lists is almost identical. So, what's the anchor? The artifacts are real, excavated, catalogued, and analyzed by teams from the British Museum, the Louvre, and the German Archaeological Institute. The mathematical systems, star charts, and metallurgical techniques have been published in peer-reviewed journals. Even the genetic markers linking pre-dynastic Egyptians to the Near East have been confirmed by the German Mummy Project. Reality check. The strongest objection is that these parallels are just the result of independent invention. Different cultures solving the same problems in similar ways. That's possible, but it doesn't explain the suddenness, the identical technical terms, or the matching mythic frameworks across continents. So, if there really was a network of knowledge keepers, how did they operate? Was it secret societies, wandering sages, or something even stranger? And if the last keys are still out there, what would it take to unlock them? And what happens if we do? Here's where the puzzle gets even tighter. If ancient knowledge really was passed hand to hand, you'd expect to see echoes in the most basic system of all, the calendar. But what we find is more than echoes. It's synchronization. Mainstream historians say calendars were invented locally, shaped by the landscape, the crops, and the stars overhead. Each culture, they say, counted time in its own way, except the numbers don't lie. The Sumerians, Egyptians, and even early Greeks all pegged their calendars to the same celestial events. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the solstices, the lunar cycle. The Mesopotamian and Egyptian years both start when Sirius appears just before dawn. That's not a local harvest date. That's a cosmic clock. But then it gets weirder. The Sumerians used the base 60 system to track months, cycles, and star movements. The Egyptians did too, except their calculations show up in temple inscriptions matching the Sumerian star tables almost digit for digit. So, how did two supposedly independent cultures, separated by deserts and centuries, end up with calendars that tick in perfect time? One possibility. There was a shared source, a hidden database of astronomical knowledge, passed through priesthoods or secret schools, ensuring that the clocks stayed in sync long after the original builders were gone. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, dated to 1650 BC, record planetary cycles with a precision that matches later Egyptian and even Greek calculation. The Thothic calendar used to predict the Nile flood is based on a 1460-year cycle. Exactly what you'd get if you tracked Sirius and the solar year together. And Asar's cycle for eclipses. It's written in both cuneiform and hieroglyphs. But hold that thought. The anomalies go deeper. The constellations themselves, Orion, the Pleiades, Leo, are mapped and named the same way in both traditions. Even the mythic stories tied to these stars line up, suggesting not just shared math, but shared meaning. That's not just parallel invention. Reality check. Critics argue that the sky is the same everywhere, so it's no surprise that ancient peoples noticed the same stars and cycle. They say trade and migration explain the rest. That's a fair objection, but it doesn't account for the identical technical terms, the matching mythic associations, or the synchronized timing of rituals and festivals across thousands of miles. So, if there really was a hidden stream of timekeepers, who were they? How did they maintain this cosmic synchronization through floods, wars, and lost empire? And if the ancients could sync their calendars across continents, what else did they coordinate? Beneath the surface and behind the scene? So, if ancient priests could sync the stars, what about the metals beneath their feet? Here's where the plot thickens, because metallurgy isn't supposed to travel as easily as a myth or a calendar. But then you find the same alloys, the same recipes popping up continents apart. Mainstream historians say metallurgy developed independently. Sumerians smelted copper and bronze. Egyptians made gold alloys. And the Indus Valley hammered out their own techniques. Knowledge spread slowly through trade routes and centuries of trial and error. Except the artifact record doesn't look slow or local. The earliest bronze from Mesopotamia, dated to around 3300 BC, shows up in forms and compositions nearly identical to those found in early Egypt and even the Caucasus. The ratios of tin to copper, the trace elements, the use of arsenic, all match up, right down to the impurities. That's not supposed to happen without direct contact or a shared manual. Then you get the tools themselves. Ancient chisels, saws, and drill bits found at sites like Giza and Uruk sometimes contain traces of nickel, cobalt, and even vanadium, elements that require advanced smelting and precise temperature control. Some of these alloys don't show up again for thousands of years. So who taught them to blend these metals so well, so early? One alternative is that there was a hidden network of smiths, engineers, or priesthoods, maybe the same ones who tracked the stars, passing down secret recipes and techniques. The knowledge didn't just trickle along trade routes. It jumped, fully formed, from one civilization to the next. But here's the credibility anchor. Chemical analyses of ancient tools and jewelry, done by labs at places like the British Museum and the German Archaeological Institute, confirm the matching alloy signatures. The earliest objects from Egypt's pre-dynastic period and Sumer's early dynasties show the same metallurgical fingerprints, even when separated by deserts and centuries. Now, watch what happens when you look at the mythic side. Both Sumerian and Egyptian texts credit their gods or divine instructors with teaching humans how to work metal. Ptah in Egypt, Enki in Sumer. Both are described as master craftsmen, keepers of the secrets of the furnace. The stories aren't about invention. They're about revelation. Except these myths also warn about unauthorized uses, hybrid beings, forbidden alloys, and the dangers of knowledge falling into the wrong hands. So, was ancient metallurgy just a lucky convergence? Or was it controlled, shared only with those in the know? Reality check. The strongest objection is that metallurgy is a basic technology, and similar methods would naturally arise wherever people experimented with fire and ore. That's fair, but it doesn't explain the matching alloy ratios, the rare trace elements, or why the most advanced techniques appear first, not last. So if the ancients could coordinate their metals as well as their calendars, what else did they synchronize? Rituals, language, or even genetic line? And if the keepers of the keys controlled the flow of metal, what were they really forging? Tools, temples, or something even stranger? So if metals, calendars, and engineering were all moving in sync, you have to wonder, what about the rituals that bound these ancient worlds together? Here's where things get unsettling. Mainstream scholars chalk up religious similarities to shared human needs. Every culture, they argue, creates gods, rites, and myths to explain the unknown and keep society running smoothly. But the details don't always fit that neat pattern. Except the same divine figures keep popping up, wearing different masks. The Sumerians had the Anunnaki, sky beings who descended to teach, judge, and sometimes punish. Egypt had the Nitaru, also described as those who came from the sky, credited with founding the first dynasty and teaching the arts of civilization. Even in the Hebrew tradition, you get the Watchers, a group of heavenly beings who interact a little too closely with humanity. But here's the kicker. The oldest texts don't just describe these beings as distant gods. They're portrayed as instructors, giving humans the measuring cord, the tablets of destinies, and sometimes even the secret of life itself. The Atrahasis epic talks about genetic manipulation, mixing divine essence with clay to create a new kind of being. That's not just myth. That's a blueprint. Then you notice the rituals. Across Sumer, Egypt, and even early Israel, you find the same core practices: ritual washing, anointing with oil, the use of incense and sacred fire, and the recitation of secret names. The language is different, but the structure is nearly identical. So what's the alternative? One possibility is that these rites weren't just spontaneous invention. Maybe they were encoded instructions, preserved and transmitted by a priesthood with roots deeper than any single culture. The rituals weren't just for show. They were keys, unlocking access to something beyond the material world. But now, the credibility anchor. The parallels are documented. The pyramid texts, the Enuma Elish, and the Book of Enoch all describe divine beings descending, teaching, and sometimes breaking the rules. Archaeologists like Samuel Kramer and Jan Assmann have traced these motifs across centuries and continents. Even the technical vocabulary for ritual objects, incense burners, libation vessels, sacred oils, matches up in cuneiform, hieroglyphs, and early Hebrew. Reality check. The strongest objection is that these similarities are just the result of cultural diffusion. Trade, conquest, and migration, spreading ideas naturally. That's a strong argument, but it doesn't explain the sudden appearance of fully developed rituals, or why the oldest versions are often the most complex. So if the keepers of the keys synchronized not just science, but spirituality, what were they really trying to preserve? Was it just social order, or a coded memory of contact with something otherworldly? And if the Watchers left their mark on religion, what traces might still be hidden in the rituals we practice today? So, if the Watchers shaped ancient rituals, what about the angels watching over modern faith? Here's the thing. Christianity didn't invent the idea of heavenly messengers, but the details of angelic ranks, fiery swords, and forbidden knowledge, those have fingerprints reaching all the way back to Mesopotamia. Mainstream theology says angels are just God's servants, pure spirits created to deliver messages and protect the faithful. Their hierarchy, from cherubim to seraphim, is supposed to be a Christian innovation, refined by centuries of doctrine. Except, the blueprint is older. The earliest descriptions of angels, especially in the Book of Enoch, sound almost identical to the Egi, or Igigi, of Sumerian myth. The Egi were watchers of heaven, tasked with observing humanity, enforcing divine law, and sometimes stepping a little too close to the mortal world. But here's the anomaly. The Egi weren't just passive observers. Sumerian tablets described them as powerful, luminous beings who rebelled against their superiors, the Anunnaki. After being forced to labor on Earth, their revolt and the consequences that followed echo the story of the fallen angels in Enoch and later Christian lore. Now, watch what happens next. The Egi's punishment? Banishment to the underworld, forbidden from returning to the heavens. In the Book of Enoch, the rebel angels are cast into darkness, chained until the final judgment. Even the language lines up. Watchers, sons of God, those who descended. That's not just a passing resemblance. So, is this just myth recycling or something deeper? One alternative is that the Christian angelic hierarchy is a direct descendant of Mesopotamian cosmology, adapted, renamed, and repackaged for a new era. The roles, the ranks, even the punishments are all mapped out in cuneiform centuries before they appear in Hebrew or Christian texts. But here's the credibility anchor. The parallels aren't hidden. They're documented. Sumerian and Akkadian texts from as early as 2000 BC describe the Egi's rebellion and banishment. The Book of Enoch, written centuries before the New Testament, lays out a story almost line for line. Scholars like Michael Heiser and Annette Yoshiko-Reed have traced these connections in detail, except the mainstream objection is that these are just literary echoes, common themes that pop up whenever humans imagine the divine. That's a strong point, but it doesn't explain why the technical terms, the roles, and even the punishments are so specific, or why the earliest Christian angelology looks like a remix of Sumerian cosmology. So, if the Egi became angels, what else slipped through the crack? And if the rituals and myths of today still carry coded memories of ancient contact, what other secrets are hidden in plain sight, waiting to be decoded? But if angelic watchers slipped from Sumer to Christianity, what about the next leap? Into the heart of Islamic tradition. Here's where the story takes another sharp turn. The Quran doesn't just mention angels in passing. It gives them jobs, specific, relentless, and inescapable. Chief among them, the Rakib and Atid, the noble recorders assigned to every person, documenting every thought, word, and deed. But here's the thing. These aren't just metaphors for conscience or memory. The texts describe the Rakib as literal, ever-present beings. One on the right, one on the left, recording everything, day and night, without rest or error. That's surveillance on a cosmic scale. Mainstream Islamic scholarship frames the Rakib and Atid as spiritual entities, reminders that nothing escapes divine justice. They're not gods, not rebels, just dutiful scribes. The idea is supposed to be unique to Islam, except the pattern is familiar. Ancient Mesopotamian tablets describe the watchers of the gates, celestial scribes who keep the ledgers of fate. In Egypt, the weighers of the heart stand by as Osiris judges the dead, their records determining the soul's journey. Even in early Christian texts, angels are tasked with keeping the books of life and death. So, why do these roles keep reappearing with the same obsessive detail? One possibility: the surveillance motif isn't just a religious trope. Maybe it's a memory, encoded and re-encoded, of a very old system of observation. Not just spiritual, but literal. The Watchers, the Edgy, the Rakib, all part of a chain of beings whose main job is to keep track. But hold that thought. The Quran's descriptions get even more technical. The Rakib and Atid are said to write with pens, their records stored in a clear book that will be opened on the day of judgment. The language is precise, almost administrative, like a cosmic bureaucracy. That's not just mythic poetry. And here's the credibility anchor. These descriptions are documented in the Quran. Surah Qaf 50, 17, 18. Surah Infitar 82, 10, 12. And in the Hadiths, with centuries of commentary from scholars across the Islamic world. The parallels to earlier traditions have been noted by academics like Angelica Newworth and Gabriel, said Reynolds, who traced the roots of celestial surveillance back to Sumer and Babylon. But now, the reality check. Critics argue that the Rakib and Atid are just universal archetypes. Every culture invents spiritual overseers to keep people on it. That's a fair point, but it doesn't explain the technical language, the administrative structure, or why the same surveillance motif appears fully formed in the earliest layers of each tradition. So, if the Rakib are the latest evolution of the Watchers, what were the ancients really describing? Was it just a metaphor for conscience? Or a coded memory of something more tangible? Maybe even technological? And if the idea of celestial surveillance is this persistent, what happens when we finally crack the code behind it? Here's where things get really strange. If celestial surveillance was more than just a metaphor, then why do the oldest monuments on Earth look like they were built to watch the sky, and maybe to be watched in return? Most experts say megalithic sites were just temples or tombs. Stonehenge, Giza, Gobekli Tepe, each supposedly a product of slow local development shaped by trial and error over a century. But the precision doesn't add up. The Great Pyramid's sides are aligned to true north with an error of less than 3/60ths of a degree. Stonehenge stones mark the solstices, lunar standstills, and even rare eclipses. At Gobekli Tepe, The T-shaped pillars are oriented to the rising of specific stars, thousands of years before conventional astronomy was supposed to exist. That's not primitive guesswork. Except there's no evidence of a gradual learning curve. The oldest layers are the most precise. Later constructions are rougher, sloppier, almost as if the original knowledge was lost, or deliberately hidden. So, what's going on? One alternative is that these sites were just ceremonial. Maybe they were observatories, machines designed to lock onto cosmic cycles, encode information, or even communicate with something beyond human reach. The layout, the alignments, the acoustic properties, each could be a piece of a much larger system. But here's the thing. The same mathematical constants show up again and again. P, the golden ratio, and even astronomical numbers, like the precession cycle, are built into the stones. The blocks at Baalbek fit so tightly you can't slide a piece of paper between them. The sound boxes inside the pyramids amplify specific frequencies, as if tuned to something or someone. That's not just architectural flair. And the similarities don't stop at the stone. The myths surrounding these places talk about star beings, watchers, and gods descending to teach, measure, and judge. The rituals performed at these sites often involve precise timing. Dawn on the solstice, the heliacal rising of Sirius, or the shadow of a stone falling at exactly the right moment. So, could these monuments be the physical code left behind by the same knowledge keepers who wrote the old texts? Now, here's the credibility anchor. The alignments and proportions have been measured and confirmed by surveyors, astronomers, and engineers. The Great Pyramid's orientation was documented by Flinders Petrie in the 1880s, and later confirmed by satellite. Stonehenge's astronomical functions have been studied by Gerald Hawkins and others. The precision at Baalbek and Gobekli Tepe is a matter of public record. Reality check. The strongest objection is that ancient people were just really good at watching the sky, and that over generations they figured out how to build these alignments through trial and error. That's possible, but it doesn't explain why the most advanced sites are the oldest, or why the same patterns and numbers show up on different continents, with no evidence of contact. So if these megalithic wonders were more than tombs or temples, if they were built to lock in on the heavens, or to send a message, what were they trying to say? And if we're finally close to cracking the code, what happens when we decode the next layer? Hidden not in myth, but in stone. Gobekli doesn't just break the rules, it rewrites them. We're told the Neolithic was a world of simple tools and simpler minds. But then you see those T-shaped pillars, carved with animals and symbols, staring out at the stars from 9,500 BC. That's 6,000 years before Stonehenge. So, what were they doing out on that Turkish hilltop, in the dark before history? Mainstream archaeology calls Gobekli a ritual center. They say it's where hunter-gatherers first gathered to worship, experiment with community, and maybe invent agriculture by accident. But the site refuses to play along. The pillars aren't just decorated, they're encoded. Foxes, scorpions, birds, and abstract glyphs are arranged in patterns that match constellations overhead. Some researchers argue that the vulture stone is a star map, marking the position of the sky as it looked over 10,000 years ago. Except, there's no evidence of a slow climb to this level of sophistication. The stonework is precise. The carvings are deep and intentional, with techniques that would challenge even later Bronze Age masons. And the alignments. The enclosures point to the rising of Sirius, the summer solstice, and the precession of the equinoxes, cycles that take centuries to track and predict. So who taught these people to read the heavens like a book? One alternative. Gobekli was a knowledge node, a place where the keepers of the keys encoded cosmic information in stone for those who would come after. Carvings weren't just art. They were a message, locked in a code that only makes sense if you know the sky. But here's the thing. The same animal symbols appear on later Sumerian seals, Egyptian temple walls, and even in the iconography of early Vedic India. The motifs don't drift or mutate, they persist, as if they were part of a shared visual language, passed hand to hand across continents and millennia. That's not random evolution. And the engineering. The pillars are set in deep sockets, arranged in circles that echo the geometry of later megalithic sites. Some weigh over 16 tons, yet there's no evidence of the pulleys, ramps, or labor force you'd expect. The builders had knowledge and purpose. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The site is real, excavated by Klaus Schmidt and his team from the German Archaeological Institute starting in the mid-1990s. The carbon dating is solid. The astronomical alignments have been mapped by researchers like Martin Sweatman. The carvings are there for anyone to see. Reality check. The strongest objection is that we're just projecting modern ideas onto ancient art. Critics say the symbols are just animals, the circles just gathering places, and the alignments just coincidence. That's possible, but it doesn't explain the precision, the repetition of motifs across cultures, or why the oldest layers are the most complex. So, if Gobekli's carvings really are a message, what were they warning us about or preparing us for? And if we can finally read the code in the stones, what will we find staring back at us from the dawn of civilization? But what if the oldest messages aren't carved in stone at all? What if the real warnings are hidden beneath the waves? Out of sight, out of mind, and almost out of reach. Here's where the mystery deepens. For decades, mainstream archaeology insisted that civilization began on dry land, river valleys, fertile plains, and the occasional hilltop like Gobekli. The sea, they said, was just a backdrop. But then sonar scans started lighting up the ocean floor with shapes that shouldn't be there. Now, watch what happens next. Off the coast of India, divers found the ruins of what looks like an ancient city near Dwarka. Massive walls, regular blocks, and what might be steps leading down into the sand. The mainstream response? Natural rock formations. Nothing more. Except the blocks are quarried, the angles are right, and the layout matches known city grids from thousands of years later. Then there's Yonaguni, off Japan. Submerged terraces, pillars, and what looks like a stepped pyramid cut into the bedrock with straight lines and 90-degree corners. The official story is that it's just geology, shaped by the sea. But the site has tool marks, and the orientation lines up with the solstice sun. So, what's going on here? One alternative is that these underwater ruins are the real missing chapters of human history. Cities swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age, when coastlines drowned and memories turned into legend. Maybe Gobekli's builders weren't the first. They were the survivors, carrying the code inland as the waters rose. But here's the thing. The same patterns show up in the Mediterranean. Off the coast of Malta and Sicily, divers have found stone blocks, causeways, and what look like megalithic temples, now 40 meters underwater. The dating is controversial. But if the structures are man-made, they predate anything on land. Now, the credibility anchor. These sites aren't rumors, they're documented. The Dwarka ruins were surveyed by India's National Institute of Oceanography. Yonaguni was mapped by marine geologist Masaki Kimura. The Mediterranean sites have been published in journals and filmed by underwater archaeologists. Except, the reality check is tough to ignore. The strongest objection is that underwater ruins are just natural formations, rocks shaped by currents and time, not by human hand. That's a reasonable point. But it doesn't explain the tool marks, the regularity, or why so many sites line up with ancient shorelines and astronomical events. So if the oldest cities are underwater, what else is waiting down there? Lost libraries, forgotten temples, maybe even the original keepers of the keys. And if we ever bring these sunken sites back into the light, will they rewrite everything we think we know about the dawn of civilization? If the ocean is hiding lost cities, then what about the people who built them? Here's the twist. Sometimes the real clues aren't in stones or ruins. They're in our blood. For years, the mainstream story was simple. Early humans spread out of Africa, settled in the Fertile Crescent, and from there, civilization slowly radiated outward. Cultures rose, fell, and mixed, but the genetic record was supposed to be a smooth gradient, no big surprises. Except the DNA doesn't play by those rules. When researchers started pulling genetic samples from ancient skeletons, especially in Egypt and Mesopotamia, they found unexpected markers. Pre-dynastic Egyptian mummies, for example, show Near Eastern haplogroups that don't fit the standard timeline for African origins. That's not supposed to happen. So, who were these people crossing deserts and seas? Thousands of years before history says they should. One possibility. Survivors from those lost coastal cities forced inland as the world's shorelines drowned. Maybe they carried not just stories and symbols, but entire bloodlines, mixing with local populations and leaving a genetic fingerprint that still shows up today. But the anomalies go deeper. The German Mummy Project found genetic links between pre-dynastic Egyptians and ancient populations from the Levant and Anatolia. Meanwhile, DNA from Sumerian-era graves in southern Iraq shows connections to both the Caucasus and the Iranian plateau. These aren't random outliers, they're patterns. Then you see the same thing in the artifacts. Shared iconography, serpents, stars, and divine beings, shows up on Sumerian cylinder seals and pre-dynastic Egyptian pottery. Metallurgical techniques, burial customs, and even language roots line up across regions separated by deserts and mountains. So what's the mainstream explanation? Most scholars say these are just signs of trade and gradual migration. People moved, ideas spread, and over centuries, cultures blended naturally. But that doesn't explain the sudden appearance of advanced skills, or why the earliest dynasties in Egypt and Sumer seem to arrive fully formed, with no local buildup. Now here's the credibility anchor. These genetic studies are real, published in peer-reviewed journals, and led by teams from the Max Planck Institute, University of Tübingen, and the German Archaeological Institute. The artifacts are catalogued in museums from Cairo to London. The overlaps aren't just claimed, they're documented. Reality check. The strongest objection is that ancient DNA is tricky, contamination, Small sample sizes and degraded material can skew the results. That's true, and geneticists are the first to admit the limitations. But the patterns keep showing up, even as methods improve and new samples are tested. So if the oldest migrations weren't just a slow drift, but a series of sudden, purposeful movements, who was orchestrating them? Were these waves of survivors, explorers, or something else entirely? And if the genetic threads still run through us today, what else might we inherit from those forgotten ancestors? Memories, instincts, or even lost knowledge waiting to be awakened. So, if ancient bloodlines carry more than just genes, what exactly are we looking for in our DNA? Here's the thing. Genetic research isn't just about ancestry anymore. It's about finding fingerprints left by civilizations we barely remember. Mainstream genetics says most modern populations are a blend of local foragers and incoming farmers, with migrations from the Near East and Africa shaping the gene pool. The story is supposed to be gradual, with no dramatic surprises. But the data keeps throwing curveballs. When scientists sequence genomes from pre-dynastic Egyptian mummies, they expected to see mostly African markers. Instead, they found a strong signal from the Near East. Haplogroups linked to Anatolia, the Levant, and even the Caucasus. That's not just a minor detail. The same pattern pops up in Mesopotamia. Early Sumerian remains show a mix of local ancestry and genetic markers from regions as far as Iran and the Black Sea. These aren't isolated outliers. They're clusters, showing up again and again. So what's going on here? One possibility is that waves of survivors from lost coastal cities, maybe even those swallowed by the sea, moved inland, carrying not just skills and stories, but their DNA. They didn't just blend in. They seeded the foundations of new cultures. But hold that thought. The anomalies don't stop at Egypt and Sumer. Genetic studies in the Indus Valley, the Caucasus, and even southern Europe reveal similar signals. Traces of a population that doesn't fit the standard migration model. It's as if a hidden thread runs through the ancient world, connecting places that should be connected. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The genetic markers are real, documented in studies from the Max Planck Institute, the University of Copenhagen, and the Egyptian Mummy Genome Project. The results have been published in journals like Nature and Science, with peer review and international teams double-checking the data. Double-checking the data. But here's where things get weird. Some of these ancient markers are linked to traits that don't make sense for the local environment. Adaptations for colder climates, unusual immune responses, even rare metabolic quirks. It's almost as if these people came from somewhere else entirely, bringing a toolkit for survival that didn't match their new homes. So, is this just random mixing, or the echo of a lost civilization? Reality check. Critics argue that ancient DNA studies are plagued by contamination, small sample sizes, and statistical noise. That's true. There's always a risk of reading too much into limited data. But the patterns keep showing up, even as methods improve and new samples are tested. And that leaves us with a bigger question. If these genetic markers are the last fingerprints of a vanished world, what else might they reveal? About our origins, our potential, or the memories we carry without knowing? What happens if we find a trait, a memory, or a skill that simply doesn't fit the known story? Something that points straight back to the lost civilizations themselves. But here's where things get even stranger. Genetic fingerprints aren't just scattered across the Middle East and North Africa. They show up on entirely different continents, in places that shouldn't have any connection at all. Mainstream history says population movements followed the obvious paths. Out of Africa, through the Levant, into Europe and Asia, then slowly branching out to the rest of the world. The story is supposed to be linear, with clear boundaries and gradual change. Except the evidence keeps leaking across those lines. In South America, some ancient remains show DNA markers that match populations from the Pacific Rim and, bizarrely, even traces linked to ancient Eurasian groups. Certain skull shapes and burial styles in Peru and Brazil echo those found in the Near East and the Mediterranean. That's not how the textbooks say it should work. Then you get the linguistic puzzle. Some words for basic tools, stars, and even numbers in Native American, Polynesian, and Old World languages are suspiciously similar. These aren't just random sounds. They're technical terms, sometimes for things like navigation or metallurgy that shouldn't have crossed oceans in the Stone Age. So, what's going on? One possibility is that ancient mariners, maybe survivors from lost coastal cultures, made contact across vast distances, sharing genes, stories, and skills. The genetic trail isn't just a record of slow migration. It might be evidence of deliberate exploration. But hold that thought. The anomalies go even deeper. Certain pottery styles, megalithic construction techniques, and even agricultural practices appear in both the old and new worlds, with no clear path of transmission. The similarities are too precise to chalk up to coincidence. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The genetic data is real. Studies from Harvard, Stanford, and the Max Planck Institute have found these unexpected markers in ancient remains from the Americas, Polynesia, and even Australia. The linguistic overlaps have been catalogued by comparative linguists for decades, and the archaeological parallels are documented in peer-reviewed journals and museum collections. However, here's the reality check. The strongest objection is that these are just cases of convergent evolution, different groups solving the same problems in similar ways, with a few random genetic matches thrown in. That's a valid point, and mainstream scientists warn against reading too much into a handful of markers or artifacts. But that doesn't explain clusters of genetic, linguistic, and cultural anomalies that keep showing up together, or why some of the most advanced techniques appear suddenly, without local precursors. So, if ancient population movements weren't just slow drifts, but included purposeful voyages and lost networks of contact, what else might be hiding in the global genetic map? And if a forgotten civilization really did reach across oceans, what traces, physical or otherwise, are still waiting to be found on the other side? But if ancient navigators really did cross oceans, and their fingerprints are scattered in our genes and artifacts, then here's the next twist. Maybe the knowledge didn't just vanish. Maybe it went underground. Now, watch what happens when you follow the trail into the shadows. Mainstream historians say secret societies are a medieval or early modern invention. Guilds, mystery cults, and philosophical circles that emerged long after the ancient world had faded. They're supposed to be the product of social change, not lost civilization. Except the symbols tell a different story. The same motifs, serpents, eyes, pillars, and stars, show up on Sumerian seals, Egyptian temple walls, and the regalia of medieval brotherhood. The language of initiation, hidden knowledge, and Keepers of the Keys, echoes across millennia.go. But here's the thing. Rituals practiced by groups like the Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and Sufi orders often mimic the structure and symbolism of ancient temple rites. The tracing boards, passwords, and secret handshakes aren't just theater. They're encoded references to architecture, astronomy, and even metallurgy. So, could these societies be more than just social clubs? One alternative is that they're the last custodians of a much older tradition, a chain of transmission stretching back to the priesthoods of Sumer, Egypt, and beyond. The mysteries weren't just philosophical. They were practical. How to measure the stars, cut stone, and maybe even manipulate consciousness itself. But hold that thought. Many of these groups claim direct descent from legendary figures. Hermes Trismegistus, Enoch, Solomon, each said to have possessed the lost word or hidden wisdom of the ancients. Their rituals reenact the death and resurrection of a master builder, the recovery of a lost artifact, or the ascent through cosmic spheres. Except the details are often suspiciously technical. Initiates are taught about geometry, the movement of the heavens, and the music of the spheres. Some traditions even preserve ancient codes, like the Pythagorean tetractys or the Sumerian base 60 system, hidden in plain sight within their ceremonies. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The connections aren't just speculation. Researchers like Francis Yates, Albert Mackey, and Jan Assmann have documented the parallels between ancient temple rituals and the symbolic language of later secret societies. The artifacts, medieval tracing boards, alchemical manuscripts, and even the architectural blueprints of cathedrals are preserved in museums and libraries worldwide. But here comes the reality check. The strongest objection is that these groups simply borrowed ancient motifs to give themselves prestige, proactively inventing a lineage that never existed. That's a fair point, but it doesn't explain the technical depth of the symbolism, or why the same mathematical and astronomical knowledge keeps surfacing in their teaching. So if secret societies really are the last echo of a lost civilization, what are they hiding in their rituals and codes? And if the keys to ancient wisdom are still locked away in esoteric traditions, who holds the real power to unlock them? And what happens if that knowledge finally comes to light? Here's where things get even more tangled. If secret societies are the last vaults of ancient wisdom, then Masonic geometry is the lock, and maybe the key. On the surface, Freemasonry looks like a gentleman's club with funny aprons and secret handshake. But step inside the lodge, and you find a world obsessed with symbols, compasses, squares, pillars, all arranged with mathematical precision. But why geometry? Mainstream historians say it's just a nod to the medieval stonemasons who built cathedrals. Geometry, they argue, was practical. How to measure, cut, and build. Nothing mystical about it, except the rituals go way beyond construction tips. Initiates memorize the Pythagorean theorem, trace sacred triangles, and learn the secrets of the compass and square. The tracing boards are filled with patterns that mirror temple layouts from Sumer to Egypt to Solomon's Jerusalem. So what's really being taught here? One alternative. The geometry isn't just about building walls. It's a code, a way to encode cosmic principles, astronomical cycles, and maybe even lost technologies. The lodge is a classroom, but the syllabus is ancient, Now, here's the kicker. The blazing star at the center of the Masonic Lodge. It isn't just decorative. It matches the Sumerian symbol for Sirius, the star that anchored both Egyptian and Mesopotamian calendars. The pillars named Boaz and Jachan, they're not random. They correspond to the twin columns at the entrance of ancient temples, marking the solstices and the path of the sun. That's not just tradition. That's transmission. But then, the numbers start to line up. The proportions used in Masonic diagrams, like the golden ratio pi and the 3-4-5 triangle, show up in the blueprints of the Great Pyramid, the layout of Stonehenge, and the floor plans of Gothic cathedrals. Even the ritual steps mirror the movements of planets and the precession of the equinoxes. So, is this just coincidence or a deliberate echo of something much older? Here's the credibility anchor. The parallels aren't just speculation. Researchers like Robert Lomas and Christopher Knight have traced Masonic symbols back to ancient temple architecture and astronomical alignments. The rituals are documented in centuries-old manuscripts, and the geometry matches measurements confirmed by modern archaeologists. But reality check. The strongest objection is that Masons simply borrowed impressive symbols from the past to legitimize their society. No hidden wisdom, just clever branding. That's a fair point, and some historians insist the geometry is just tradition, not transmission. Except, that doesn't explain why the same mathematical codes and cosmic alignments keep surfacing in places the Masons claim as spiritual ancestors across continents and centuries. So, if Masonic geometry is more than a relic, if it's a cipher for ancient knowledge, what happens if someone finally cracks the code? And if these patterns are hiding instructions, not just symbols, what are they really meant to unlock? If these codes are more than decoration, then who's been keeping the instructions safe all this time? Here's the thing. The deeper you dig into the world of secret geometry, the more you run into whispers about guardians, not just of symbols, but of something much bigger. Mainstream historians say there's no hidden order, just scattered societies, each with its own myths and rituals. The idea of a global chain of knowledge keepers? They call it fantasy. But the patterns don't care about borders. The same cosmic numbers, the same sacred ratios, and the same star alignments keep popping up in places that supposedly never talk to each other. From the Sumerian Ziggurats to the Egyptian temples, from the blueprints of Solomon's temple to the floor plans of medieval cathedrals, the math is almost identical. Except that's not supposed to happen. So who's connecting the dots? Some researchers point to the Anunnaki, the sky beings of Sumerian legend, as the original source. The story goes that, after the flood, their knowledge was handed down to a select priesthood. These guardians became the architects, astronomers, and high priests of every civilization that followed. But there's a twist. The guardians didn't just preserve stories. They encoded knowledge in rituals, architecture, and, most importantly, geometry. The compasses and squares, the blazing stars, and the twin pillars. Each is a piece of a puzzle that only makes sense if you know what to look for. Now, watch what happens when you follow the trail. The oldest temple blueprints in Mesopotamia use the same measurements as the Great Pyramid. The measuring cord of the Sumerian gods is the same tool used by medieval masons to lay out cathedrals. Even the tablets of destinies, said to control fate itself, are described as shining, encoded objects that only the initiated can read. That's not just preservation, that's curation. But the Guardians didn't always agree. Some texts hint at schisms, splinter groups who took the knowledge underground, hiding it from kings, conquerors, or anyone deemed unworthy. The result? A patchwork of secret societies, each guarding a fragment of the original code, sometimes cooperating, sometimes at odds. So, what's the credibility anchor? The artifacts are real. The geometry is measurable. The continuity of symbols and proportions has been documented by archaeologists, historians, and even NASA engineers studying ancient alignments. The stories of keepers of the keys show up in texts from Sumer, Egypt, Greece, and medieval Europe. Reality check. The strongest objection is that this is just projection. Modern minds seeing patterns where none exist, or secret societies inventing ancient lineages to boost their own mystique. That's a fair shot, but it doesn't explain the technical depth, the precise math, or why the same knowledge shows up in places separated by oceans and millennia. So if the guardians of the Anunnaki legacy really did hide instructions in plain sight, what were they trying to protect or prevent? And if someone finally puts all the pieces together, what happens to the world as we know it? Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because some people think the code has already been cracked, except it's not the way you'd expect. In the last 100 years, a strange pattern has emerged. Inventors, engineers, and even a few rogue archaeologists claim to have rediscovered principles hidden in ancient texts and monuments. But these aren't dusty relics. They're blueprints. Take Nikola Tesla. He obsessed over the numbers 3, 6, and 9, hinting that they were the key to the universe. He studied pyramids, sacred geometry, and resonance, convinced that the ancients had tapped into a source of energy we barely understand. Then there's the so-called pyramid power crowd. They claim the Great Pyramid isn't just a tomb, but a machine, one that can preserve food, sharpen razor blades, or even focus electromagnetic energy. Most mainstream scientists laugh it off as pseudoscience, but the anomalies keep piling up. Some Russian researchers in the 1990s built scaled-down pyramids and reported odd effects, changes in water structure, plant growth, even shifts in local weather. The data is controversial, but the experiments happen. Now, watch what happens when you look at modern architecture. The same proportions used in ancient temples, golden ratios, pi, and astronomical alignments show up in everything from Washington, D.C.'s city plan to the United Nations headquarters. Sometimes it's just aesthetic. Other times, designers admit they're following sacred geometry for reasons they can't fully explain. So, is this just coincidence or a deliberate revival? One alternative is that fragments of the old code have survived, passed down through esoteric circles, secret societies, or even buried in patent offices. Every so often, someone stumbles across a piece and tries to put it to use. But here's the credibility anchor. The blueprints are real. Tesla's notebooks, the Russian pyramid studies, and the architectural plans for major landmarks are all publicly available. The proportions and alignments can be measured and verified by anyone with a ruler and a compass. Except the mainstream explanation is always the same. Skeptics argue that pyramid power is just a myth, that sacred geometry is psychological, and that any effects are placebo or coincidence. They point out that no peer-reviewed study has ever confirmed free energy, levitation, or miracle cures from ancient tech. That's a fair objection, but it doesn't explain the persistent fascination, the recurring experiments, or why so many independent researchers keep finding the same patterns, sometimes with results that defy easy explanation. So, if the Guardians hid the instructions to protect us, or to keep something locked away, what happens if someone finally unlocks the whole system? And if ancient technology is more than a legend, what's the risk if it falls into the wrong hands? Or the promise if it's finally understood? So, what happens when someone tries to bring ancient metallurgy back to life? Here's where the story shifts from theory to the fore. It sounds simple. Melt some copper, add a little tin, and you've got bronze. But the old recipes don't work like modern ones. Ancient alloys often included trace elements, arsenic, antimony, even vanadium, that should be there if you're just grabbing whatever's handy. Except the ratios aren't random. Researchers who've tried to replicate Sumerian and Egyptian metals keep hitting a wall. The tools and weapons don't just match in appearance. Their microstructures and hardness are off the charts, even compared to some modern alloys. But here's the kicker. Some ancient chisels and saws cut stone that modern steel can barely scratch. The copper, soft stone, tools, theory falls apart when you test them on granite or diorite. Yet, the old quarries are full of tool marks that suggest something stronger. Something we can't quite reproduce. So, what's missing? One possibility. The real secret wasn't just the mix, but the process. Ancient texts mention sacred fires, divine winds, and purification rites during smelting. Maybe these weren't just rituals. They were instructions for controlling temperature, atmosphere, or even using unknown catalysts. Then there's the anomaly of lost color. Egyptian, blue gold, Sumerian electrum, and the deep red copper of Anatolia all have chemical signatures that don't line up with anything you get from modern smelting. Replicating the color is hard enough. Matching the durability is nearly impossible. But the biggest mystery is the living metal. Some legends describe alloys that heal themselves, resist corrosion, or even hold a charge. Mainstream science calls this fantasy, but a few researchers have reported odd effects. Metals that seem to resist tarnishing, or tools that stay sharp long after they should have dulled. Now here's the credibility anchor. Replications have been attempted by metallurgists at Oxford, MIT, and the British Museum. They've analyzed ancient artifacts with electron microscopes and X-ray fluorescence. The anomalies are real, documented in peer-reviewed journals and museum reports. Reality check. The strongest objection is that ancient smiths just got lucky, or that modern contamination is skewing the results. That's possible, but it doesn't explain why the same accidents happened across continents, or why the old texts are so specific about process and ritual. So, if someone really does crack the code, if lost metallurgy is revived, what could it mean for technology, energy, or even medicine? And if the ancients left booby traps in their instructions, how do we know we're not about to open Pandora's box? Here's the thing. If lost metallurgy is just the first layer, What happens when you dig deeper? Some researchers think the ancients weren't just making better tools. They might have been tapping into energy sources we still don't understand. It sounds like science fiction until you start looking at the anomalies. Take the Ziggurats and pyramids. Mainstream archaeology says they're just monuments, tombs, or platforms for ritual. But the construction techniques and materials suggest something else was going on. Granite blocks with high quartz content, shaft-like chambers, and copper traces in places with no obvious function. That's not just architecture. Then there's the recurring theme of living stones and sacred fires. In ancient texts, the Sumerians wrote about Ibzu, temples powered by water, and mysterious shining stones. The Egyptians described the Benben stone, said to radiate energy, and even call down the god. But here's where it gets weirder. Some 19th and 20th century inventors tried to recreate these effects. Victor Schauberger's water turbines, Tesla's oscillators, and even Russian pyramid experiments all reported odd energy phenomena. Changes in air ionization, plant growth, and even electrical output. Except nobody could explain why the shapes and materials mattered so much. So, what's the alternative? Maybe the ancients figured out how to harness natural forces? Piezoelectricity from quartz? Static from moving water? Or resonance from specific geometries? The temples and pyramids weren't just symbols. They were functional machines, built to tap into Earth's hidden currents. Now watch what happens when you look at the artifacts. Gold wires, copper rods, and what some call the Baghdad battery show up in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The mainstream says they're just jewelry or storage jars. But the chemical residues suggest they were used for electroplating, or maybe something more. That's a leap, but the evidence is there. The Venus tablets of Amasaduqa record cycles that match electromagnetic fluctuations. Some ancient sites show magnetic anomalies that still baffle geologists. And the fire from heaven, described in the Atrahasis epic, it sounds a lot like plasma discharge. But here's the credibility anchor. These artifacts and structures are real. Analyzed by teams at the British Museum, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and independent labs. The claims of energy effects have been published, tested, and debated for decades. Reality check. The strongest objection is that all this is just wishful thinking. Ancient people didn't have electricity, and any energy effects are natural coincidences or modern contamination. That's a solid point, but it doesn't explain the consistent patterns, the technical language in the oldest texts, or why so many inventors keep stumbling onto the same results. So, if someone does manage to revive the energy systems of the ancients, what would that mean for power, health, or even communication? And if the ancients built in failsafes or warnings, how do we know we're not about to cross a line they never wanted us to touch? Here's where the trail gets slippery. If ancient energy tech is even partly real, then where did the knowledge go? Did it just disappear? Or was it hidden on purpose? Mainstream history says the answer is simple. When empires fall, skills are lost. Libraries burn, temples crumble, and the secrets of the past fade into legend. But the pattern doesn't fit the story. Some knowledge seems to vanish overnight, then reappear centuries later, in places it shouldn't. Medieval alchemists claim to rediscover lost arts. Sufi mystics, Gnostic sages, and even Renaissance engineers hint at wisdom passed down through secret channels. It's not just lost, it's redirected. Now watch what happens when you zoom in on the details. The same technical diagrams, spirals, double helixes, geometric grids, show up in Sumerian tablets, Egyptian papyri, and manuscripts from the Library of Alexandria. The language changes, but the symbols stay the same. Except the mainstream says these are just metaphor, mystical doodles, not blueprints. So why do the metaphors match up with modern physics diagrams? Why do some esoteric texts describe resonance, polarity, and energy flows in ways that sound suspiciously like field theory? One possibility: the hidden streams of knowledge never dried up. They just went underground, preserved by select priesthoods, secret societies, or even rogue scholars who knew the dangers of open disclosure. But here's the anomaly. Every time a civilization gets too close to rediscovering the old tech, there's a backlash. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the suppression of the Templars, the persecution of alchemists. Each event wipes out a generation of progress, as if someone or something is guarding the threshold. And yet, the code keeps leaking through. Alchemy becomes chemistry. Hermetic diagrams morph into circuit schematics. Magic squares turn to quantum algorithms. The same patterns resurface, disguised as art, myth, or sacred geometry. That's not just coincidence. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The transmission lines are real, documented in the writings of scholars like Francis Yates, Antoine Favre, and Lynn Picknett. The diagrams survive in museum archives, private collections, and even the Vatican Library. The overlap with modern science isn't just claimed. It's been mapped out by historians of ideas. Reality check. The strongest objection is that all this is just pattern seeking, finding connections where none exist, and reading too much into ancient art. That's a fair warning. But it doesn't explain the recurring technical accuracy, the sudden jumps in knowledge, or why suppression follows so closely on the heels of rediscovery. So, if the hidden streams are real, who's been steering them? Is there a gatekeeper at work? Or is it just the chaos of history? And if the next breakthrough is already bubbling beneath the surface, what's going to happen when it finally bursts into the open? If there really are hidden streams of knowledge, then who's been swimming in them all this time? And how do you trace a secret that's designed to stay secret? Here's the thing. Every time history seems ready to leap forward, you find the same pattern. A small group, cloaked in ritual and symbols, claims to hold a key that the rest of the world has lost. But these aren't just clubs or cults. They call themselves mystery schools. The Pythagoreans, the Hermeticists, the Magi, and the keepers of the Eleusinian mysteries. Their initiates are taught to speak in riddles, to memorize geometry, to guard formulas and chants as if their lives depend on it. Except the curriculum is always more than just myth. The teachings jump from astronomy to medicine, from architecture to music. Some schools claim to trace their lineage straight back to Egypt, Sumer, or even Atlantis. The secrets aren't just about gods. They're about how the universe works. So why all the secrecy? One mainstream answer is that these schools protected political power. If you can predict eclipses, heal the sick, or build impossible monuments, you become indispensable to kings and emperors. Knowledge is leverage. But then the anomalies start piling up. Mystery schools pop up in places with no obvious connection. Greece, Persia, India, China, ... Their symbols overlap. The serpent, the staff, the all-seeing eye. Even their initiation rituals echo each other. Death and rebirth, descent into darkness, the revelation of a hidden light. That's not cultural drift. That's a pattern. So what's the alternative? Maybe these schools weren't just about power. They were vaults. They preserved and transmitted fragments of a lost science, passing it down through coded language and ritual drama. The great work wasn't just spiritual. It was technical. Now, here's the credibility anchor. The existence of these schools is documented. Plato writes about the Eleusinian rites. Pythagoras is said to have studied in Egypt, and the hermetic corpus survives in Greek, Coptic, and Arabic. Archaeological digs at Eleusis, Dendera, and Persepolis have uncovered temples with secret chambers and encoded inscription. But the strongest reality check is this. Critics argue that the mysteries were just psychological theater, ways to bind communities together or control the masses. They say the secrecy was about social cohesion, not lost technology. That's a fair point, but it doesn't explain the technical sophistication of the teachings, or why initiates were sometimes executed for revealing forbidden knowledge. And it doesn't explain the sudden bursts of innovation that follow when these schools open their doors. Think of the Greek Golden Age, the Islamic Scientific Revolution, or the Renaissance. So, if the mystery schools really were the keepers of a hidden stream, what happened when their secrets leaked out? Did the world change for the better, or did it unleash something nobody could control? And if there are still mysteries left to reveal, who's guarding the last gates? And what's on the other side? So who's actually standing guard at the edge of the unknown? And why do the gates seem to close just as someone gets too close to the real answer? Here's where the trail gets murky. Mainstream historians say the guardians of ancient knowledge are long gone. Just myths, legends, or the inventions of secret societies trying to boost their own mystique. They see the cosmic code as a metaphor, not a manual. Except the pattern keeps repeating. Every time a breakthrough looms, alchemy in the Islamic Golden Age, the rediscovery of Greek science in the Renaissance, the sudden leaps in mathematics and astronomy. There's a shadowy group in the background. Sometimes they're scholars, sometimes priests, sometimes anonymous initiates who vanish as soon as the spotlight turns their way. But the gates never stay open for long. The Eleusinian mysteries were wiped out by decree. The Library of Alexandria went up in flames. The Templars were rounded up and silenced. Each time, the knowledge slips back into the dark. So who benefits from keeping the code locked away? One possibility. Not all guardians are on the same side. Some want to protect humanity from dangers we're not ready for. Think of the legends about Atlantis or Babel, where forbidden knowledge brings disaster. Others, though, might be gatekeepers for power's sake, hoarding secrets to keep control. Now, watch what happens when you follow the breadcrumbs. The same cryptic warnings appear in texts from Sumer to the Dead Sea Scrolls. He who opens the gates unbidden shall unleash chaos. The words of power must not be spoken lightly. Even in modern times, whistleblowers and renegade scientists talk about. Invisible hands, steering research away from dangerous frontiers. But there's an anomaly. Some breakthroughs do get through. The printing press, the calculus, the harnessing of electricity. Each one slips past the guardians, only to change the world overnight. Sometimes the code leaks, and when it does, the world never looks the same again. So what's the alternative? Maybe the cosmic code isn't just about technology or science. Maybe it's a set of instructions for balancing knowledge and wisdom. Warnings built into the system so we don't outpace ourselves. The guardians, then, aren't just jailers. They're stewards trying to keep the balance. Here's the credibility anchor. The stories of lost knowledge and hidden guardians aren't just conspiracy theory. They're documented in texts, artifacts, and the sudden suspicious gaps in the historical record. The cycles of discovery suppression are mapped by historians like Francis Yates and Graham Hancock, and the pattern holds up across continents and centuries. Reality check. The strongest objection is that all this is just human nature. Powerful people always try to control information, and the rest is coincidence or paranoia. That's a fair point, but it doesn't explain the precision of the timing, the repeated warnings, or why so many different cultures tell the same story about guardians at the gates. So if the cosmic code is real, and the guardians are still out there, what are they watching for now? Are we on the verge of another breakthrough? Or another disaster? And if the last gate finally opens, what will we find waiting on the other side? So what really happens when the last barrier falls? Do we inherit a lost golden age, or open a box we can't close? Here's the thing. The legacy of the Watchers isn't just about ancient ruins or secret societies. It's about the way their fingerprints keep showing up, right when the world seems ready to leap into the unknown. But the mainstream story says the Watchers are just myth. Sumerian gods, Egyptian Neteru, the biblical Nephilim. Each culture, we're told, invented its own cosmic teachers to explain the unexplainable. Their wisdom, just allegory, nothing more. Except the anomalies refuse to go away. The oldest texts don't just tell stories. They lay out technical knowledge encoded in myth. The measuring cord of the Sumerians, the tablets of destinies, the books of Thoth. These aren't just symbols. They're described as real objects, with rules for use and warnings for misuse. So, what if the Watchers weren't only legends? What if they were a real group? Maybe not gods, but a class of initiates, scientists, or even survivors from a lost world, who seeded civilization with knowledge, then vanished or went underground. Now, here's where the credibility anchor hits. The technical content in those ancient records is real, studied by linguists, archaeologists, and historians for over a century. The astronomical alignments, the mathematical codes, the sudden leaps in metallurgy and engineering, they're all documented, not just claimed, but the pattern is always the same. A burst of knowledge, a warning about forbidden secrets, then a collapse or a cover-up. The Watchers are praised as bringers of light, but also blamed for chaos, like Prometheus, punished for sharing fire. And the warnings are eerily specific, mixing divine essence with clay, building towers to the sky, unlocking the names of power. Each time, the texts hint at a line that shouldn't be crossed. The legacy isn't just about what was given, but about what was lost, and why. So, are we repeating their cycle? Today we stand on the edge of breakthroughs in genetics, AI, and energy. We're decoding DNA, building machines that learn, and probing the nature of consciousness itself. But the old warnings echo louder than ever about hubris, about knowledge without wisdom, about the risk of opening doors we can't close. Here's the reality check. Skeptics say all this is just pattern seeking. Ancient people were smart, but not superhuman, and the rest is myth layered on top of coincidence. That's a fair argument, but it doesn't explain the precision, the recurring cycles, or why the same warnings show up in every tradition, across every era. So, what is the true legacy of the Watchers? Is it a map to our highest potential, or a cautionary tale about the cost of curiosity? And if we're about to step through the last gate, are we ready for what's waiting on the other side? Or are we just repeating the oldest story in the book? Here's the paradox. The closer we get to the edge, the more the ancient warnings start to sound like instructions. But what if the Watchers weren't just cautioning us? They were challenging us. Mainstream history says civilization advances through trial and error. We invent, we stumble, we learn. Progress is slow, messy, and sometimes painful. Except the old records paint a different picture. They describe sudden leaps, moments when new knowledge appears, fully formed, as if someone flipped a switch. The birth of writing, the rise of city-states, the jump from stone tools to metallurgy. These aren't just evolutionary steps. They're revolutions. So, what triggered those jumps? One alternative is that wisdom, not just raw information, was the catalyst. The Watchers, or whoever played that role, didn't just hand out blueprints. They taught discernment, context, and the consequences of pushing too far, too fast. But here's the thing. Every ancient tradition ties power to responsibility. The tablets of destinies could only be read by the worthy. The measuring cord was useless without the right intention. Even the books of Thoth came with warnings about misuse. It's not just about having the code. It's about knowing when and how to use it. Now, look at the anomalies. Civilizations that flourished longest weren't always the most advanced, but the most balanced. Sumer, Egypt, early India, they all built systems for channeling knowledge through ritual, law, and story. When that balance broke, when wisdom was ignored or corrupted, collapse followed. So maybe the real legacy isn't the tech, but the framework for using it wisely. That's what's missing in today's race for breakthroughs. We're unlocking genetic codes, building AI, and probing the fabric of reality. But who's teaching discernment? Where's the modern measuring cord to keep us from repeating the Watchers' mistakes? Now, here's the credibility anchor. The oldest texts, Sumerian, Egyptian, Hebrew, even early Greek, don't just warn about forbidden knowledge. They lay out systems for ethical inquiry, for weighing consequences, for passing on wisdom as well as skill. Scholars like Samuel Kramer and Mirsha Eliade have documented how these traditions shaped law, science, and philosophy. But reality check. Critics argue that ancient wisdom is just old superstition, useful for social control, but irrelevant to modern science. That's a strong point. Yet, when societies ignore the ethical dimension, history shows the same pattern. Innovation without wisdom leads to chaos, not progress. So, if the Watcher's real gift was a map for transforming civilization through wisdom, not just technology, are we ready to follow it? Or are we still chasing shortcuts, risking the same downfall that ended their story? And if the next leap is coming, what will it take to make sure we don't just repeat the cycle, but finally break free?